Senator Bob Menendez, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. He is unveiling a new immigration plan this morning, calling for executive action to expand legal pathways to reduce pressure at the border, like a parole program for states in need of workers, increases to border resources and processing asylum seekers, expanding humanitarian assistance for migrants and refugees across the Americas. And he's calling on us to do more to counter human trafficking and smuggling. Senator, good morning.
Good morning, Poppy. Good to be with you.
It's really notable. This is not legislation, right? You're not saying Congress do it, because they haven't. We all remember you were part of the Gang of Eight. That was a decade ago, and still no comprehensive action. This is an ask of the White House. You gave them this on Friday. Have you talked to them?
I did. We had a conference call last evening, and I think it is a constructive effort to deal with our challenges at the southern border in a way that we haven't. We have just been reactive and punitive, and that hasn't worked. People keep coming. The reality is you have to look at this in terms of the hemisphere. There are 20 million displaced people, refugees throughout the southern hemisphere. The UN High Commission on Refugees says 20% of the world's refugee problems are right here in the Western Hemisphere, but it only spends 8% of its money. So if you understand that there are 20 million people already displaced throughout the hemisphere, then you need to deal with the countries in the hemisphere to meet part of that challenge, to create legal pathways in their countries, to incentivize them to the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank to create those legal pathways. And at the same time, there are things that we can do, that the administration can do, like the asylum officer rule that replaces immigration judges and allows an asylum officer at the border to begin the process of determining whether someone has a legal claim or not. And if they don't, then they get deported. And finally, you have Republican governors even who are calling for a greater immigration flows for the purposes of dealing with the 10 million jobs in America that are unfulfilled. Well, here's an opportunity to meet both challenges, create productivity, economic opportunity for America, provide these people a parole to do some of those jobs that we can't get Americans to do. Those are just some of the elements of our 4 pillars and 28 recommendations.
So the White House has read through this. You talked to them last night. I read through the whole 16-page plan. About 10 pages of it is actual actionable things they could do. Did they agree to do any of them with you on the phone?
Well, we didn't get to an agreement that they're going to work on our plan immediately, but they are looking for, suggestions that are different than their plan, because their plan simply hasn't created any less action at the border. If we continue down the road where we've been, which is reactive and responsive and an enforcement-only mechanism, we're going to continue to have the same problem that you cited earlier in terms of the new figures.
Senator, it sounds to me like you're saying, so I'll ask you, are you saying the Biden administration has failed on immigration on the southern border?
The Biden administration had a vision which I introduced into legislation in the first year of the administration. That was the right vision. But unfortunately, it didn't put the pandemic and then other issues, it didn't put the effort behind it necessary to realize the goal. And so now it finds itself reacting to what's happening at the border. And instead of having a more broader plan and a vision that actually can embrace dealing with countries so that people don't come to the border in the first place, to be able to process those that do come to the border in an efficient manner, and those who don't have a right then have to get rejected. And then lastly, creating new legal pathways that have shown themselves, even some of the administration's initiatives have shown themselves to stem the tide from certain countries. When you create a new legal pathway, all of those things would dramatically change the reality at the southern border. I hope that they take this moment and actually change course in a way that can actually make for a more secure, safer border.
The Biden administration has not called this a crisis, despite repeated asks. I asked Secretary Mayorkas that a few months ago. 60 Minutes just asked him if this is a crisis. He does not call it a crisis. Do you call it a crisis?
Well, I don't call it a crisis, but it can become one if you understand that there are 20 million people in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America and Central America, who are displaced, who are refugees, who are seeking asylum across the hemisphere. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that unless we work with other countries in the hemisphere, they're going to make their march up north. So the numbers we're looking at now would be insignificant compared to 20 million people on the march.
Right.
This is the time to engage them where they are.
Okay. You said last month that President Biden himself risks becoming, and these are your words, the asylum denier in chief if the administration follows through with plans that they're weighing right now to restart family detention for migrants. They came in to office saying we want a more compassionate approach. But now we know from reporting they are considering detaining these migrant families. We also know what the science shows about the impact of that on children, even if they are detained with their parents. What would Biden have to do to have you say that he has indeed become the asylum denier in chief?
Well, Poppy, first of all, thanks for pointing this out. Look, the reality is that failed. All of that family detention didn't stop people from coming to the border, but it created enormous stresses on children, and it didn't result in what we wanted, number one. Number two is asylum has been part of our history as a nation. It's in our laws. If we are a nation of laws, this is one of our laws. It started going back to when Jews were turned away during the Nazi era, and then the United States Congress passed the asylum law. So since then, we have had asylum as an opportunity. Doesn't mean that you get it automatically. We need to preserve that. If the administration continues on its transit ban and other elements in which basically it undermines even the opportunity to make a case for asylum, then it would fall into that category. I hope it doesn't do that. I think it's looking for a different path.
I do want to ask you about just a stunning story on the front page of the New York Times this morning. They're reporting that the White House and federal agencies repeatedly ignored warnings that many of these migrant children were working in dangerous jobs that violated child labor laws across the United States. They document many children that were taken to all sorts of different states and put into this dangerous work with a real lack of follow-up. They couldn't even find some of the children. The White House says it's unacceptable that companies would use child labor. They said they're working on strengthening the system. But what is your level of concern about this after reading it?
Well, I think it's outrageous and it's horrific that when a child comes and ultimately becomes part of our custody, that they are released in a way that allows them to be exploited in terms of child labor. In the 21st century, in the United States, child labor, I don't care which child it is, it's horrific, it's unacceptable, and we have to do a much better job of ensuring that when a child ultimately comes within our custody, before we release them, that we are releasing them into an environment in which they will not be exploited. That is our obligation. When the government detains someone, it is our obligation to make sure that their safety is ultimately preserved.
Senator Menendez, we appreciate that. And please come back as you continue these conversations with the White House. This is a critical issue for many, many voters in both parties. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.